Must be nice to have the easiest job at this table, my daughter-in-law Courtney said with a laugh as she lifted her wine glass, and the rest of the family laughed right along with her. I smiled too. Not because it was funny, but because at 70 years old, I had learned that silence often reveals more than arguments ever could. Thanksgiving had always been my favorite holiday. For more than 40 years, it was the one day when my home felt like the center of the world. The smell of roasted turkey, fresh rolls, cinnamon pie, and sage stuffing drifting through the house always made me feel like everything was right, even when life wasn't. This year was different. My husband had been gone for 3 years. The house felt larger now. Quieter. The sound of my footsteps echoed in places that once felt warm and full. Still, I woke up before sunrise that Thanksgiving morning. I tied on my old apron, the blue one with faded leaves stitched across the pockets, and started cooking. By noon, every surface in my kitchen was covered with dishes. Sweet potatoes. Green bean casserole. Cranberry sauce made from scratch. Pumpkin pie cooling beside the window. I worked for hours because that was what I had always done. Family mattered. Traditions mattered. Even if I sometimes wondered whether I mattered anymore. By 4 o'clock, everyone had arrived. My son Ryan walked in carrying a store-bought cheesecake. Courtney followed behind him wearing a designer sweater that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Their daughter Madison came in glued to her phone. The house filled with voices, laughter, and the sound of football playing on television. To anyone looking in from the outside, we probably seemed like the perfect American family. But perfection is often just a performance. We sat down at the dining table just after 5. The same oak table where Ryan had done his homework as a child. The same table where my husband used to carve the turkey every year. I took my usual seat at the end and listened. At first the conversation felt normal. Vacation plans. Home renovations. Promotions. Then Courtney began steering the discussion. She always had a way of doing that. Ryan and I were talking, she said. Retirement must be nice. No deadlines. No bosses. No stress. She looked directly at me. Some people really have it easy. A few people chuckled. I smiled politely and reached for the gravy boat. Trust me, she continued. If I could spend my days baking pies and watching television, I'd be thrilled. More laughter. Even Ryan laughed. Not loudly. Just enough. That hurt more somehow. Madison glanced up from her phone and smirked. Grandma's living the dream. The table erupted again. I looked around the room slowly. Nobody noticed that I hadn't touched my food. Nobody noticed the empty chair beside me that still existed in my mind every Thanksgiving. Nobody noticed that I had spent 2 days preparing the meal they were mocking. Courtney leaned back in her chair looking pleased with herself. I'm just saying, some people have all the luck. The laughter continued. I folded my napkin carefully and placed it beside my plate. Then I smiled. A calm smile. The kind that made people assume I hadn't heard the insult at all. But I heard every word. And I remembered every word. Because while my family spent Thanksgiving laughing at me, something else was already moving quietly beneath the surface. Something none of them knew. Something that would change everything before the week was over. The house felt unusually quiet the next morning. Thanksgiving leftovers filled the refrigerator, neatly stacked in plastic containers that would probably last me a week. I stood at the kitchen counter with a cup of coffee warming my hands and looked out the window at the bare maple tree in my backyard. The last few leaves clung stubbornly to the branches despite the cold November wind. In some ways, I understood exactly how they felt. I had spent most of my life holding on to traditions. Holding on to memories. Holding on to people who seemed determined to drift away. The comments from dinner replayed in my mind, not because they surprised me, but because they confirmed something I had been trying not to see. The laughter had not been spontaneous. It had been comfortable. Familiar. Practiced. That realization hurt more than the jokes themselves. I washed the breakfast dishes, wiped down the counters, and tried to move on with my day. Yet a strange feeling lingered. A feeling that something was slightly out of place. Around noon I walked to the mailbox at the end of my driveway. Bills. Advertisements. A grocery flyer. Nothing unusual. As I turned back toward the house, I noticed my neighbor Frank raking leaves across the street. He waved. I waved back. Simple. Ordinary. Normal. The kind of interaction that reminded me there were still people in the world capable of basic kindness. Back inside, I sat at my desk in the small room that used to belong to Ryan when he was a teenager. Most of his trophies were gone now, but faint outlines still marked the walls where posters once hung. I opened a drawer searching for an old property tax receipt. The county had mailed a notice months ago, and I wanted to compare the numbers. After several minutes of searching, I realized the document was missing. That was odd. I kept everything organized. Every receipt. Every statement. Every insurance form. My husband used to joke that I could find paperwork faster than any accountant. I checked another drawer. Then another. Nothing. By evening I had searched the entire filing cabinet. The missing notice bothered me more than it should have. Not because of the paper itself, but because it reminded me of other small things that had disappeared over the past year. A bank statement that never arrived. An investment summary I had expected to receive every spring. A letter from an insurance company that Ryan insisted must have been delayed. At the time, each incident seemed insignificant. Life was busy. Mistakes happened. Now they felt connected somehow. I pulled out an old notebook and began writing down every instance I could remember. 1 item became 3. 3 became 7. 7 became 12. By the time I finished, nearly 2 pages were covered with notes. I stared at the list for a long time. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Important documents had been vanishing for months. Maybe longer. A knot formed in my stomach. Around 7 that evening my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. I almost ignored it. Almost. Instead I answered. Mrs. Whitmore, a calm voice asked. This is George Bennett. The name sounded familiar, though I could not immediately place it. I apologize for calling during the holiday weekend, he continued, but I have been trying to reach you regarding several important documents. I sat up straighter. What documents? There was a brief pause on the other end. The reports concerning your financial holdings and trust distributions. My heart skipped. I am sorry, I said slowly. I do not know what reports you are talking about. Silence followed. Not awkward silence. Shocked silence. The kind that arrives when someone realizes a conversation has suddenly become much more serious than expected. When George finally spoke again, his voice sounded different. Careful. Measured. Mrs. Whitmore, he said quietly, when was the last time you personally reviewed your financial records? I looked down at the notebook filled with missing documents and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather outside. For the first time, I realized Thanksgiving dinner might not have been the biggest problem in my life. It might have only been a distraction from something far larger hiding in plain sight. I did not sleep much that night. After ending the call with George Bennett, I sat alone at my kitchen table long after midnight, staring at the notebook in front of me. The house was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of old floorboards settling into the cold. I kept replaying his question in my mind. When was the last time I personally reviewed my financial records? The truth embarrassed me. It had been years. After my husband passed away, I trusted the systems we had put in place. I trusted the professionals. More importantly, I trusted my family. The next morning, George called again. His voice was calm but direct. He asked if we could meet in person. By 10 o'clock, I was sitting across from him in a quiet office downtown. He was a tall man with silver hair and reading glasses perched low on his nose. The moment he opened a thick file folder, I knew this was not a routine conversation. He slid several documents across the desk. Mrs. Whitmore, these reports have been mailed repeatedly over the past 2 years. I looked at the addresses printed on the envelopes. My address. My house. My mailbox. Yet I had never seen them before. George frowned as he turned another page. Several notices were acknowledged as received. I looked up. Acknowledged by whom? He adjusted his glasses and pointed to a signature. My stomach tightened. It was not mine. It was Courtney's. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. I simply stared at the page. The signature was unmistakable. Elegant. Confident. Familiar. I had seen it on birthday cards, school permission slips, and holiday invitations. George carefully turned to another document. Then another. The pattern was impossible to miss. Correspondence had been redirected. Notifications had been intercepted. Important financial summaries had never reached me. How much information have I not received? I finally asked. George leaned back in his chair. Quite a bit. He opened another section of the file. Investment reports. Trust statements. Property records. My late husband's estate had performed far better than I ever imagined. Certain assets had increased significantly in value. Income distributions had been issued regularly. Opportunities requiring my approval had come and gone without my knowledge. I felt as though I were reading someone else's life. The woman described in those documents appeared financially secure. Meanwhile, I had spent the past few years clipping coupons, delaying home repairs, and worrying about rising grocery prices. My hands remained steady, but something inside me shifted. Not anger. Not yet. Clarity. George studied me carefully. Mrs. Whitmore, I need to ask something difficult. Has anyone been helping manage your affairs? Courtney's face appeared instantly in my mind. Her comments at Thanksgiving. Her confidence. Her certainty that I knew less than everyone else. I answered carefully. My daughter-in-law often handles family paperwork. George nodded slowly, as though several pieces had just fallen into place. He slid one final document across the desk. Then I believe that is where we should begin. Looking. I lowered my eyes to the page. What I saw there made every missing letter, every delayed statement, and every strange incident over the past 2 years suddenly feel connected. For the first time, I was no longer searching for a problem. I was looking directly at evidence that someone had been making decisions behind my back for a very long time. The document listed a series of authorization requests that required my review. Beside each entry was a status note showing that the matter had already been resolved. Approved. Acknowledged. Processed. The problem was simple. I had never approved any of it. I had never acknowledged any of it. I sat quietly as George allowed me time to absorb what I was seeing. Outside his office window, people moved through the city carrying coffee cups and briefcases, completely unaware that my understanding of the last few years was unraveling page by page. I thought back to countless small moments that had seemed harmless at the time. Courtney volunteering to collect the mail whenever Ryan and I were busy. Courtney insisting she could help organize family paperwork because technology confused me. Courtney smiling as she explained that online accounts were easier to manage if fewer people had direct access. Each memory returned with a different meaning now. What I once viewed as helpful suddenly looked calculated. George opened another folder. Inside were records showing communications sent from financial institutions, attorneys, and property managers. Many of them included notes documenting follow-up conversations. Not with me. With Courtney. I felt a strange calm settle over me. Years ago, I would have reacted emotionally. I might have confronted someone immediately. Age had taught me a different lesson. Information first. Reactions later. Do not contact anyone yet, George said. It was as if he had read my thoughts. If mistakes were made, we need to understand the full picture before anyone knows we are asking questions. I nodded. The advice matched exactly what I was already thinking. When the meeting ended, I drove home through quiet suburban streets lined with bare trees and holiday decorations. Inflatable snowmen stood in front yards. Christmas lights hung from rooftops. Everything looked cheerful. Yet I could not stop replaying the details. By the time I pulled into my driveway, another realization had surfaced. Ryan might not know any of this. The thought stayed with me as I entered the house. My son had many flaws. He avoided conflict. He trusted too easily. He often chose convenience over difficult conversations. But deception required attention. Consistency. Planning. Those were qualities that fit Courtney far more than Ryan. That evening, I received a text message from her. Hope you are doing well. Thanks again for Thanksgiving. The message ended with a smiling emoji. I stared at it for several seconds. Then I replied with a simple sentence. Thank you, dear. It was the same response I would have sent a week earlier. A month earlier. A year earlier. If she felt any concern, she did not show it. A few minutes later, another message arrived. Madison had posted new family photos online. Everyone looked happy. Ryan was smiling. Courtney stood proudly beside him. Looking at the picture, I realized something important. The people in that photograph believed they understood me completely. They saw a 70-year-old widow who spent her days baking pies, tending flowers, and living quietly. They believed I was paying no attention. They believed I would never ask questions. For the first time since leaving George's office, I smiled. Not because anything was funny. Because I finally understood the advantage of being underestimated. And before this was over, that advantage was going to matter a great deal. The next few days passed quietly on the surface. Beneath that calm, I began paying attention in a way I had not done for years. George continued reviewing records while I focused on something simpler. Patterns. People reveal more through habits than words. Every morning I sat at my kitchen table with coffee and a legal pad. I wrote down dates. Phone calls. Conversations. Small details that once seemed meaningless. By Wednesday, the list had grown longer than I expected. Courtney called twice that week. Both times her voice sounded unusually cheerful. She asked whether I needed help with errands. She offered to stop by and organize paperwork. A month earlier, I might have appreciated the gesture. Now I politely declined. Her disappointment lasted only a second, but I heard it. It was there in the brief pause before she recovered her usual warmth. You are sure? She asked. I know paperwork can get overwhelming. I smiled even though she could not see me. I am managing just fine. After hanging up, I added another note to my pad. That afternoon George emailed several additional documents. I spent hours reading through them at my dining room table. The same table where my family had laughed only days earlier. Some records showed routine activity. Others raised questions. There were requests for information submitted on my behalf. Changes to communication preferences. Updates to contact information. Individually, none of it seemed dramatic. Together, they painted a picture I could no longer ignore. Someone had been quietly positioning themselves between me and important parts of my financial life. Thursday evening Ryan called. How are you doing, Mom? He asked. His voice sounded tired. Genuine. Familiar. For a moment I pictured the little boy who used to bring me dandelions from the backyard. I am doing well, I said. We talked about ordinary things. The weather. Football. Madison's college applications. Then he casually mentioned that Courtney had been helping him review family finances lately. The comment landed softly, but it stayed with me long after the conversation ended. Later that night I opened an old photo album. My husband smiled from dozens of pictures. Fishing trips. Backyard barbecues. Family vacations. In nearly every photograph, he was looking directly at the camera. Confident. Steady. The kind of man who noticed details. I found myself wondering what he would say if he were sitting across from me now. Probably something simple. Pay attention to the facts. Do not rush. Let the truth arrive on its own. The following morning George called again. This time there was a different energy in his voice. Not concern. Certainty. Mrs. Whitmore, he said carefully, we have identified several transactions and authorizations that require closer examination. I remained silent. There is more here than missing mail. I looked out the window toward the frost-covered lawn. The sun was rising over the neighborhood, turning everything gold. For the first time, I realized the situation might be larger than I originally believed. Much larger. George continued speaking, but one sentence stood out above everything else. The person responsible likely believes nobody is looking. I glanced toward the family photograph sitting on the shelf beside me. Courtney was smiling in the picture. So was everyone else. Slowly, I smiled too. Because for the first time, someone was finally looking. Saturday morning arrived with a clear sky and a sharp winter chill. I woke before sunrise and sat by the kitchen window with my coffee, watching the neighborhood slowly come to life. A few houses already had Christmas lights glowing against the darkness. Everything looked peaceful. Meanwhile, George and I were quietly putting the final pieces together. He called shortly after 8. His voice carried the calm confidence of someone who had finished a difficult puzzle. I think we have enough, he said. I listened as he explained the findings. Records had been gathered. Communication histories had been verified. Authorization requests had been traced. Nothing dramatic on its own. No single document capable of telling the entire story. But together they formed something far more powerful. A pattern. Consistent. Detailed. Impossible to dismiss. When the call ended, I remained seated at the table for several minutes. My hands rested calmly around my coffee mug. I thought I would feel angry. Instead, I felt focused. There is a difference. Anger clouds judgment. Focus sharpens it. Around noon, Courtney called again. Ryan and I were thinking about coming by tomorrow, she said. Maybe we could bring lunch. Her tone sounded warm. Caring. Almost affectionate. I looked out the window at the bare branches swaying in the breeze. That sounds lovely, I replied. In fact, why do we not invite everyone? There was a brief silence. Everyone? She asked. Ryan, Madison, and a few family members, I said. It has been too long since we all spent time together. Her hesitation lasted less than a second. That sounds wonderful. After we ended the call, I smiled to myself. She had no idea that she had just accepted an invitation she would later regret. That afternoon, George and I spoke once more. We reviewed every detail carefully. No surprises. No accusations. No confrontation beforehand. Just facts. Verifiable facts. The strongest kind. By evening, the plan was simple. Family lunch on Sunday. Nothing unusual. Nothing alarming. Exactly the sort of gathering Courtney would expect me to host. I spent the rest of the day preparing the house. Fresh flowers on the dining table. Clean linens. Extra chairs. The familiar routines felt comforting. As I arranged place settings, memories drifted through my mind. Birthday dinners. Graduation celebrations. Anniversary parties. For decades I had been the person who brought everyone together. The organizer. The caretaker. The dependable constant. Somewhere along the way, they had mistaken kindness for weakness. That misunderstanding was about to become very expensive. Sunday morning arrived. By 11 o'clock, the dining room looked ready for guests. Sunlight streamed through the windows and reflected off the polished oak table. I stood quietly at the end of the room and took it all in. The scene looked ordinary. That was exactly what I wanted. At 11:30, the first car pulled into the driveway. Then another. Ryan arrived carrying dessert. Madison followed behind him. Courtney stepped through the front door smiling confidently, completely at ease. She hugged me and complimented the flowers. Her eyes briefly scanned the room. She seemed pleased by what she saw. Comfortable. Relaxed. Certain. I welcomed everyone inside. Conversation filled the house. Laughter echoed through the hallway. The atmosphere felt light and familiar. Watching them, I realized something important. Every person in that room believed they understood the purpose of this gathering. Every person except me. Because hidden inside a folder resting quietly in my study were documents that would change the direction of several lives before the afternoon was over. We gathered around the dining table just after noon. Plates were passed. Drinks were poured. Conversation moved easily from holiday shopping to college plans and neighborhood gossip. Anyone walking past the house would have seen nothing unusual. That was the beauty of the moment. The truth rarely announces itself. It waits quietly until the exact second it can no longer be ignored. I listened more than I spoke. Ryan discussed a project at work. Madison talked about a university she hoped to attend. Courtney smiled and guided conversations the way she always did, effortlessly placing herself at the center of the room. Every now and then she glanced toward me with the confident expression of someone completely comfortable with the situation. I wondered how long that confidence would last. When lunch ended, I stood and thanked everyone for coming. Then I excused myself briefly and walked to my study. The folder was exactly where I had left it. Neat. Organized. Waiting. I carried it back to the dining room and placed it gently on the table. The shift in atmosphere was immediate. Ryan looked confused. Madison lowered her phone. Courtney tilted her head slightly. "Mom, what is all this?" Ryan asked. I sat down and folded my hands. "Something important," I replied. Nobody spoke. I opened the folder and removed the first document. Last week I learned that several financial reports addressed to me never reached me. Ryan frowned. Courtney remained perfectly still. I continued. One document became 2. 2 became 5. I moved carefully through the evidence. Missing correspondence. Redirected communications. Authorization acknowledgments bearing signatures that were not mine. Every page added another piece to the picture. Ryan's expression changed first. Confusion gave way to concern. Then concern gave way to disbelief. "What exactly are you saying?" he asked quietly. Before I could answer, the front door opened. A moment later George Bennett entered the dining room. I had invited him earlier that week. Seeing him there seemed to remove any remaining doubt about the seriousness of the situation. George greeted everyone politely before taking a seat beside me. He explained the findings calmly and professionally. No accusations. No dramatic language. Only facts. Dates. Records. Verified communications. The room grew quieter with every sentence. Courtney attempted a smile. "There has to be some misunderstanding," she said. George nodded politely. That possibility was examined. He slid several copies of supporting documentation across the table. The smile disappeared. Ryan picked up one page after another. I watched his eyes move across signatures, account records, and communication logs. Several times he looked toward Courtney as if expecting an explanation that never came. Madison stopped scrolling on her phone entirely. Nobody touched the dessert sitting untouched in the center of the table. The silence became heavier than any argument. Finally Ryan placed the documents down. His voice sounded smaller than I had ever heard it. Courtney. That single word carried years of trust behind it. Courtney looked from him to the papers and back again. For the first time since I had known her, she seemed uncertain. Truly uncertain. I sat quietly and allowed the facts to speak for themselves. There was no need for anger. No need for raised voices. Everything that needed to be said was already resting on the table between us. And as I looked around the room, I realized something remarkable. Just 1 week earlier, these same people had laughed as though I understood nothing. Now nobody was laughing at all. Nobody rushed to fill the silence after that. The room remained frozen around the dining table while the reality of the document settled over everyone. Ryan looked exhausted. Not angry. Not yet. Just exhausted. It was the expression of someone discovering that a foundation he trusted might not be as solid as he believed. Courtney finally spoke, but her confidence was gone. She explained that she had only been trying to help. She said she handled paperwork because family finances were complicated. She said she thought she was making things easier. The explanations came carefully, one after another, but they struggled against the weight of the record sitting in front of us. George remained professional. He answered questions when asked and clarified details when necessary. Nothing more. Nothing less. Facts have a way of standing on their own. Eventually, Madison broke the silence. Grandma never knew any of this, she asked quietly. Nobody answered immediately because everyone already knew the answer. Ryan lowered his eyes toward the documents again. I could almost see him replaying years of conversations in his head. Missed statements. Missing mail. Decisions that had somehow always been explained away. Small moments that once seemed ordinary now looked very different. I felt sympathy for him. That surprised me. After everything that had happened, I expected satisfaction. Instead, I felt sadness. Families do not fall apart all at once. They drift apart one overlooked detail at a time. One assumption at a time. One moment of convenience at a time. The lunch ended shortly afterward. Nobody had much appetite left. Plates remained half full. Coffee cups sat untouched. One by one, people gathered their things and prepared to leave. Madison hugged me before walking out the door. The hug lasted longer than usual. Ryan stayed behind for a few minutes after everyone else left. We stood together in the kitchen where I had spent so many holidays cooking for him over the years. For a moment he looked like the young boy I remembered. Lost. Uncertain. Mom, he said quietly, I should have paid more attention. I looked at him for a long moment before nodding. Yes, I said gently. You should have. There was no cruelty in my voice. There did not need to be. The truth was painful enough. After he left, the house became quiet again. I cleared the dishes slowly and loaded the dishwasher. Outside, evening settled across the neighborhood. Christmas lights blinked in nearby windows. Somewhere down the street, children were laughing. Life continued as it always does. Later that night, my phone buzzed several times. Messages arrived from family members who had attended the lunch. Some expressed concern. Others apologized for jokes they suddenly viewed differently. A few admitted they had underestimated me. I read each message carefully. Then I set the phone aside without responding. Not because I was angry. Because I finally understood something important. Respect that appears only after a crisis is not the same as respect that was present all along. The next morning, George called with an update. Several corrective actions were already underway. Records would be reviewed. Communications would be restored directly to me. Questions that had remained unanswered for years would finally receive answers. I thanked him and ended the call. Then I carried my coffee to the dining room window and watched the sunrise spread across the frosted lawn. For the first time in a very long while, I felt something I had almost forgotten. Not victory. Not revenge. Peace. 3 weeks later, the house felt different. Not because the furniture had changed or because the seasons had moved closer to Christmas, but because something invisible had shifted. For years, I had lived with the quiet assumption that my role in the family was fading. I thought growing older meant slowly moving to the background while everyone else stepped forward. I was wrong. What disappeared was not my value. It was the illusion that other people had the right to define it. The practical matters continued to move forward. George kept me informed as records were corrected and communication channels were restored directly to me. Documents now arrived where they were supposed to arrive. Questions received answers. Information reached the person it belonged to. The process was not dramatic. It was orderly. Professional. Quiet. Exactly the way important things should be handled. Ryan called more often during those weeks. Sometimes we talked for 5 minutes. Sometimes for 30. We did not revisit every painful detail. We did not need to. Certain lessons speak loudly enough on their own. One Saturday afternoon he stopped by unexpectedly. We sat together in the living room while snow drifted gently outside. He looked around the house as if seeing it differently for the first time. The photographs. The holiday decorations. The old bookshelf his father built decades ago. I took a lot of things for granted, he admitted. I nodded. Most people do, I said. Neither of us raised our voices. Neither of us argued. The conversation felt honest in a way many conversations had not felt for years. A few days before Christmas, Madison visited alone. She helped me decorate cookies and listened to stories about her grandfather that she had never heard before. At one point she looked up from the kitchen counter and smiled. Grandma, I think people forget how much you know. I laughed softly. That happens sometimes. Not anymore, she said. The confidence in her voice made me smile. Christmas Eve arrived with fresh snow covering the neighborhood. Light sparkled across rooftops. The air smelled faintly of pine and cinnamon. That evening, family gathered once again around my dining table. The same table. The same chairs. The same room. Yet everything felt different. Not because anyone was pretending. Because nobody was. Conversations were kinder. Attention was genuine. People listened when others spoke. Respect no longer felt like an afterthought. As dinner came to an end, I looked around the room. Ryan was helping clear plates. Madison was laughing at something her cousin had said. The tree glowed softly in the corner. Outside, snowflakes drifted through the darkness. Peaceful. Quiet. Real. For a moment, I remembered that Thanksgiving afternoon when laughter had echoed around this table at my expense. The memory no longer hurt. It taught. There is a difference. Pain asks why something happened. Wisdom asks what it revealed. What that week revealed was simple. The strongest person in the room is not always the loudest. Sometimes it is the person who remains calm long enough for the truth to arrive. I lifted my coffee cup and looked around at the people I loved. Then I smiled. Because respect is a funny thing. Many people only recognize its value after they risk losing it. Fortunately for my family, they learned that lesson before it was too late. And fortunately for me, I learned something even more important. Never let someone else's opinion convince you to forget your own worth.